How do you write original music that fits into a cinematic world which already has one of the most recognizable and classic film scores ever written? How do you do that when you can't reuse or quote the themes that were already written? Bear McCreary's score to Rings of Power is amazing in how it does this. To understand why McCreary's score is so great in this way, you have to understand how it relates to Howard Shore's score for The Lord of the Rings. I'm writing an article that covers this in more depth, but for this video, I wanted to show you the coolest connections between the most important musical themes in The Rings of Power and The Lord of the Rings. Once you're able to hear these musical links, you might never be able to unhear them. The Lord of the Rings trilogy was released by New Line Cinema in the early 2000s. It takes place in the Third Age of Middle-earth, and its score was composed by Howard Shore. One of the most important and recognizable themes is what Shore calls the history of the ring. This theme signifies when the ring changes ownership or makes significant progress in its journey. In its full form, the theme starts with repetition of a basic idea. In classical music theory, the term sentence is used to describe phrases which have repetition of an idea at the beginning. So I'm going to say this theme is loosely sentential. Let's focus on only the first idea for now. I want to define a few distinctive characteristics of these two measures, and I'll call them the upward pull of a semitone, circular melodic shape, and harmonic reframing by step. Listen to how the first note feels like it is pulling upward to the note just above it. Whether or not we call this first note a chromatic lower neighbor or a sharp 11, the point is that when it does go up by semitone, it reaches a more consonant member of the chord. There's no rule requiring that this note go up, but when it does, there's a sense of magnetism towards the higher note. There's another Howard Shore theme that begins with a similar pull upward, and it represents the evil of the ring, Sauron and Mordor. One of its first occurrences sounds like this. Just like the history of the ring theme, the evil of the ring begins with a note a semitone below a more consonant chord tone, and then it moves up by semitone to that note. The evil of the ring theme is harmonically simpler than the history theme, and it typically has more aggressive orchestration. In both of these examples, the semitone upward landed on the fifth of the chord, but we could also create a feeling of this upward pull toward other chord tones, such as the third, which would sound like this. If I have that pull toward the third of a major chord, then it sounds like this. Now let's step back a bit more and consider the melodic shape of the first two measures, which I'll refer to as having circularity. I can define circularity in more precise terms. It involves a melody circling around the notes a step above and a step below before returning back to the starting note. Since it circles through both the neighboring note above and below, I'll call it a form of double neighbor. There's something else going on while this melodic line wraps back around to the same pitch it began on. The harmony moves down by step, so that the same note which pulled upward in the first measure now sits within the chord in the second measure. Two things are happening with this initial note. At an immediate level, it resolves upward by semitone, but more broadly, it also circles as though it is suspended over two chords. But it is an interesting sort of suspension in which the note begins as a dissonance and is made consonant by a change of chord. For this video, I'll use harmonic reframing to refer to the way that harmonic change can shift a note from sounding dissonant to sounding consonant. And when the roots of each triad are also a step away, I'll call that harmonic reframing by step. Now let's look back at the harmonic progression of F minor to E minor. I want to define some distinctive aspects of it, so that I'll have a way of exploring other progressions which might sound related to this one. F minor to E minor involves triads that are both minor, roots a step apart, the root motion not just a step apart but also downward, and all individual voices moving by semitone. Depending on the aspects I choose to preserve, I can think about other progressions that still sound somewhat related to this one. For example, if I want minor triads a step apart, D minor to E minor would also work. But what's different is that the progression now moves up by step, and not all voices are moving by semitone. If you're open to major triads and only need individual pitches to move by semitone, but not all in the same direction, then A-flat major could also work. Taking this approach, there are a lot of options, and I'll come back to this in discussing McCreary's themes for the Rings of Power. Now that you know the components of the theme, I want to demonstrate how you can combine them to make variations on this theme that will still sound like the same theme. Using B as the starting pitch meant that harmonic reframing would place it on the fifth of the E minor triad, but we could instead have our target note be the third of an E minor triad. If I keep the progression of F minor to E minor, then G in the first measure will not only be harmonically reframed as a chord tone, it can also have the upward pull of a semitone in the first measure. There's slightly less dissonance at the beginning, but it still sounds like the theme, because almost all of the components have been preserved. If we transpose everything up a third so that the goal chord is now G minor, we have the variation that Howard Shore uses for his History of the Ring theme right after the ideas that land on E minor. This transposition breathes variety into the phrase while also building a large-scale chromatic descent, so that the melody, which first circles the pitch B, then circles around B flat. I also want to point out that the motion of E minor to A flat minor involves two minor triads, and all individual voices move by semitone or common tone, so that it sounds like a related chromatic progression. Let's listen to the full phrase, and I'll also give you the measures that lead in, since they feature the components I've been discussing. In the low strings, the pitch C is harmonically reframed by step. It first appears as a dissonance against a B flat minor triad, and then becomes consonant with an A minor triad. The progression B flat minor to A minor again involves two minor triads related through root motion down by step. And that link between A minor and F minor is similarly smooth. The icing on the cake is that by reframing C, there's a sense of large-scale melodic descent by reframing C, then B, and then B flat. All audio examples you'll hear throughout this video are fast and rough mock-ups with MIDI instruments. I only want them to give you a sense of the concepts I'm discussing, but I don't want this educational video to be a substitute for listening to the original music. Instead, I'm hoping it inspires you to go and listen again to the scores for The Lord of the Rings and The Rings of Power with a new perspective. Before looking at McCreary's themes, I want to write one more variation of this theme. Shore had the melody circle around B and be reframed as the fifth of a triad, then it circled around B flat to be reframed as the third of a triad. So to make sure we really understand, let's continue the pattern. I'll make the next idea circle around A, because that continues the chromatic descent, and then I'll reframe that pitch so that it is the root of the goal chord. A major could work if you want some variety, but I'll just use A minor to continue the pattern of all minor triads we've had so far. I need the first measure to feel the pull of an upward semitone, That means that the triad there will need B flat in it, since B flat is the note a semitone above A. Any triad with B flat will create this upward pull, but I'll pick B flat minor for my demo since it uses root motion down by step to get to A minor. I don't want this to sound too repetitive, so I'm not going to repeat each two-measure idea. There's one more little feature worth pointing out in Shore's theme. When there's repetition of a basic idea, the end of each idea subtly changes. Notice how the ideas alternate between having a leap down and holding a single sustained note. You can see in the theme that I wrote, I preserved this pattern of alternation even when I didn't repeat each idea, so that the first idea had the leap down, the second one had a sustained note, and the third one had another leap down. Now we can dig into some music from The Rings of Power. This TV series had its first season released by Amazon Prime, and it takes place long before the Lord of the Rings films in what is called the Second Age of Middle-earth. Importantly, Amazon only got the television rights for J.R.R. Tolkien's books, but not the film rights, which remain with New Line Cinema and their parent company Warner Brothers. This meant Bear McCreary had to write an original score that would sound like it was from another age, while being contractually unable to quote any of Howard Shore's classic themes from the films. His score is amazing on its own, but the way he maintains continuity without quotation is extraordinary. Let's start by listening to a rough mock-up for his theme associated with the character Halbrand and the Southlands region. The lead sheet shown here is how Bear McCreary himself defines the theme in his blog. Halbrand turns out to be Sauron, and the Southlands become the realm of Mordor. Since Sauron is the one who creates the One Ring, that means that the character Halbrand in the Rings of Power is linked to the progress of the ring, and that will become central to the Lord of the Rings trilogy. McCreary beautifully crafts this connection in his music by making this theme for Halbrand link into Shore's History of the Ring without directly quoting it. Notice immediately how it begins with the upward pull of a semitone. When the note F sharp goes up a semitone to G, it feels like it was pulled there, since G is more consonant with E minor than F sharp is. The melody is simpler and sounds distinct from Shore's ring theme, but it does have circularity by moving through an upper and lower neighbor before looping back to the first pitch. The note F sharp is also harmonically reframed by step. In this case, the pitch F sharp entered with a more dissonant relationship to E minor. But after circling around to the notes above and below, it returns as a consonant chord tone to a D major triad. We have here an original theme, but many musical components are shared with Shore's theme for the History of the Ring. The Halbrand theme still sounds distinct from Shore's, though. One reason has to do with the harmony. Notice that the progression of E minor to D major involves triads whose roots move down by step, just like Shore's History of the Ring. But in McCreary's progression for Halbrand, it's diatonic. Both chords can belong to the same diatonic scale, unlike the progression of F minor to E minor. The diatonic progression sounds more organic and folk-like. Another reason that Halbrand's theme might sound distinct has to do with orchestration. Halbrand and the Southlands theme are often associated with Nordic folk instruments such as the Hardanger fiddle, adding to the sense that it's from another era. I did use a MIDI fiddle in my audio example, but you really need to check out the original recordings to hear authentic performances on these instruments. To summarize the similarities and differences I've discussed, I'm going to use a more consistent string orchestration that's closer to Howard Shore's history theme. I'll start with Halbrand's circular melody and use diatonic reframing. Then I'll adjust the melody to match Shore's history of the ring, but keep the diatonic progression that reframes F sharp. After that, I'll adjust the progression to chromatic reframing by step, so that it sounds fully like Shore's history of the ring theme. There are more subtle links between the themes you can also listen for. Each has a loosely sentential design with variations on a basic idea endings to alternate between sustained pitches and endings that leap down. There's also tonal motion between E minor and G minor, but the harmonic route to get there is more chromatic in Howard Shore's theme. Overall, it's a perfect encapsulation of McCreary's aim to write musical continuity without quotation. McCreary did write another theme in the Rings of Power which has a similar sort of circularity to Halbrand's theme, and fittingly it's his theme for Sauron. If you take the shape of Halbrand's theme, but start from an octatonic segment instead of a diatonic one, and then you play it backwards, you end up with the theme for Sauron in the Rings of Power. Let's revisit Shore's History of the Ring theme again before approaching McCreary's theme for Isildur. The progression of F minor to E minor involves a triad moving to another triad a step below it, and I mentioned that the progression was too chromatic to fit within a single diatonic scale. Halbrand's theme had diatonic motion down by step between triads by starting on E minor and then stepping down to D major. But there's another option for triads that move down by step and are still diatonic. Instead of an F minor chord, we can start with F major. This still preserves the root motion down by step. It also takes away the potential clash between A flat and A natural. To best connect this to previous examples, I'll call this a modal sort of E minor, which uses F natural instead of F sharp. Although there are some contexts where you might want to think about this set of pitches as being A minor or C major. Moving between F major and E minor is the main progression underlying Elendil and Isildur's theme, which McCreary uses to also represent a subset of Númenóreans he calls the faithful. The melody isn't exactly circular in the way I've defined it previously, but it still approaches the fifth of E minor via a double neighbor figure. It is loosely sentential as well, with repetition of a basic idea at the beginning, along with subtle adjustments for the last note, just like we've seen previously in both the History of the Ring theme and Halbrand's theme. When the melody leaps down, we have a melodic gesture that starts and ends on the same note. And maybe it exhibits a subtle degree of harmonic reframing. The pitch E repeats with each harmony. For the F major harmony, it's less consonant than it is for E minor. This is admittedly subtle because the note being reframed doesn't arrive on the downbeat like in previous examples, but I can bring it out by having the strings hold that note. The theme doesn't start with an upward pull of a semitone, but that does happen later on. For example, the note E pulls up to F over a D minor chord. And notice how that note E, which immediately pulls upward, is also harmonically reframed, such that it becomes a chord tone on the downbeat of the following measure. There's also a much more poignant upward semitone when the note B pulls up to C over an A-flat major chord. This pull of B to C will sound really similar to the pull that opens Howard Shore's history theme. It has the same two pitches in a very similar harmonic context. Here's the same two notes pulling upward over F minor as they did for Shore's history theme. There's a little more though. The harmonic contexts are both chromatic and involve root motion down by semitone. Shore's theme moves from F minor to E minor, and McCreary's moves from A minor to A flat major. If you don't know your Middle-earth history, you may be wondering why Isildur's theme would be so continuous with Howard Shore's History of the Ring theme, which signifies progress of the One Ring, such as when its ownership is transferred. The reason is pretty straightforward. When Sauron gets defeated, the ring goes next to Isildur. Isildur is the one next in line in the history of the One Ring. Before you go back and re-listen to the original scores by Howard Shore and Bear McCreary, and you absolutely should, I want to bring out the musical continuity one more time. I'll put the themes back to back in a single audio example. Listen for circular melodic shapes, the upward pull of a semitone, harmonic reframing by step. Once you can hear the connections, you might never be able to unhear them. I've set up a Patreon page where I'll post more ideas about Middle-earth music, a tutorial on making circular music notation, and other extra content.